This session will show you how to write two chapters, the results or findings chapter and the discussion or analysis chapter. These chapters will be discussed together because they are interdependent. They relate to each other. They build on each other. The discussion chapter cannot be understood without the results chapter. Likewise, the results chapter cannot be understood without the discussion chapter. Just to recap, we have covered the introduction, methodology, literature review, and now we will discuss the results and discussion chapters. In this session, we will cover the findings or results chapter, then the discussion or analysis chapter, then we will discuss how we can analyze our findings, then we will bring all of this together by looking at two templates of the findings and discussion chapters. In essence, the results chapter and discussion chapter are sisters. They interact with each other, they build on each other, and they cover similar themes. They are so related that you can merge the results chapter and discussion chapter into one chapter. We will talk about that later. The results chapter requires you to describe your findings, describe what you found. For example, presenting the comments of interviewees, you are not analyzing or critiquing these comments, you are just presenting them. On the other hand, the discussion chapter requires you to uncover your findings. You want to reveal your findings. You want to make apparent from your findings that which is not apparent. You want to uncover the meaning of the data that you have collected. This unearthing of meaning is analysis. This is true analysis. This goes right back to the original Greek meaning of analysis, which is to set free, to release. You want to set free the meaning. You want to release the meaning. Because when you collect your data, it is just words. It is just numbers or just ticks. So you want to uncover or release the meaning from your data. What do these ticks indicate? What do these numbers reveal? What do these interviews tell us? What story can we get from this? You want to release the meaning from the data you have collected. This is one of the most profound aspects of your dissertation because you are finding meaning in the meaningless. Your data is essentially meaningless. It's just numbers or words. So it is your job to make sense of it. If you can do that, then you will achieve a very high mark. So just to recap, in the results chapter, you describe. You describe what is apparent from the findings. This is a surface level observation. You just report what you find. This is not contentious. What I mean by this, it is not debatable. It is not disputable. It is factual. No interpretation. You are not interpreting the data. You're just presenting the data, just the interview comments or the survey results. So the language is confident because there is a very small chance that you are wrong. You are just describing what is in front of you. At the other end of the spectrum, the discussion chapter is the complete opposite. You are uncovering. You are looking for a deeper meaning. You want to go below the surface. You are making explicit what is not apparent. You are making visible that which is invisible. You are essentially reading between the lines. You look for meaning in your data. You want to read between the lines of your interviewees' comments. You want to explore the unsaid, or you want to elaborate on their comments. When you uncover, it's contentious because you may be right and you may be wrong. Even though you are putting forward the most plausible reasons, you could still be wrong. So this is contentious. And because you may be right or wrong when you uncover, you have to write in a very cautious manner, tread carefully. Arguably, this may be due to, this could be a result of, this indicates, very cautious language. Do not commit yourself because it is essentially your interpretation. All interpretation is subject to error. I have several scenarios here, and I want you to tell me if they are an example of describing or uncovering. Displaying graphs and tables. Is this an example of uncovering or describing? Yes, describing. Uncovering. Describing. Describing. uncovering, and finally, describing. Is this portion uncovering or describing? Does this belong in the discussion chapter or the results chapter? This is an example of describing. It belongs in the results chapter. This is an example of describing. It belongs in the results chapter. This is an example of describing. It belongs in the results chapter. This is an example of uncovering. It belongs in the discussion chapter. We will now focus on uncovering. There are two general ways to uncover your findings. You can uncover a hidden meaning. This is best suited for qualitative interview data. Or you can uncover a problem. This is good for quantitative and qualitative data. We look at both of these techniques in more detail. Just to note two things. First, I see this notion of uncovering as truly artistic. It takes a creative and imaginative mind to create a story from our data. We essentially give meaning to the meaningless. Second, these techniques should be seen as supplementary or additional to your chosen form of data analysis. Many of you have chosen a specific form of data analysis. Many of you are using very rigid and orthodox coding and analysis approaches. Stick to those approaches, but use these two techniques to give your work more clarity. I hope this is clear. Starting with uncovering a hidden meaning. This is where you read between the lines. You elaborate on the data. You want to release the meaning from the data you have collected. Is there a story that needs to be unearthed or a pattern that needs to be revealed? This is a profound quote that captures the spirit of uncovering a hidden meaning. Look between the lines. Read between the words. The most important things are left unsaid and unheard. For example, let us uncover the hidden meaning of this statement. There are only 2 real universities in England. What is behind this sentence? Let's release the meaning of this sentence. What is the meaning behind this? We can see from this sentence that there are echoes of classist, elitist thinking. Maybe this individual has an alternative definition of the university. And also, how does this person view graduates of non-Oxbridge universities? Just from these 6 words, we're able to have this wider discussion. Our statements are rarely neutral. Much of our dialogue points to wider themes. Feel free to interpret the data that you collect, but make sure to be cautious and avoid wild claims. Keep your interpretations very conservative. To uncover a problem, you need to uncover some tension, contradiction, or conflict or drama in your work. It can't be too easy or too straightforward. You need to show the bumps in the road. The person marking your work needs to see that you struggled with something, then try to resolve it. You need to be very explicit about uncovering a problem and trying to solve it. Here are 4 ways to uncover a problem. So if your findings contradict the literature, you need to highlight the contradiction and suggest why there is a contradiction. I put an example here. If there is a huge difference in your responses, this is a problem. You are unable to get a clear picture because the responses are so different. You can't see many patterns because the data is so varied. Or you interview person A, she says one thing, then you interview person B and they say something completely opposite. Highlight the discrepancy. Then try to think of a reason for such discrepancy, especially if you did not expect to see such divergence. On the other hand, if the vast majority of interviewees or respondents agree, then you need to inquire why this is so. If you encounter consensus or massive similarities in the data that you collected, then try to explain why this is so. Why is everybody singing from the same hymn book? People are varied. We are all from different backgrounds, different ontologies. So how can it be possible that we agree with such consensus? So you need to look at the root of this consensus. What could be the neutral, what could be the central cause of this agreement? If the elephant in the room is never mentioned or identified, explain why. The elephant in the room is a major problem that is present, but nobody discusses it. So you may have read about a major issue in the literature, which is present in a particular industry, and you conduct a survey with people in that industry, but nobody discusses the issue. This is odd. This is a problem. The elephant may be prominent in the literature, prominent in the media, prominent everywhere, but yet only a handful of interviewees mention it. So, for example, in the NHS, staff burnout is the key issue. So you would expect NHS staff to mention burnout in their interviews, but many downplay this issue of burnout, or maybe they only slightly mention it. It's not considered a big deal. Why is this? You need to investigate this. So we have discussed describing and uncovering. Your results and discussion chapters are also typified by two other themes, specifying and generalizing. In your results chapter, you need to specify your findings. You need to adopt a specific focus on your data. You should only concern yourself with presenting your data. Do not look beyond your data. Do not connect your data with the wider world. You should only focus on what you found. In complete contrast, the discussion chapter requires you to generalize your data. The role of the discussion chapter is to connect your data to the wider world. You need to generalize the data that you collected. How does your data relate to or impact wider society? How does your data relate to or impact the wider literature? When you generalize your data, this is how you show the value of your research. You connect the specific details of your research with the outside world. If you want to publish your research, you will need to relate the specific nature of your data to wider society. So to recap, in the results chapter, you present the content of your interviews or surveys or questionnaires or data set. This content is specific to you. Then in the following discussion chapter, you connect your data to the wider world. It is that simple. It is like you are focusing on a specific aspect, then you zoom out to present a wider view. There are three types of generalizing that you will do in the discussion chapter. Number one, show the prevalence in the wider world of what you observed. Number two, you show the wider contextual issues. And number three, you connect your data with the literature. We will look at these three types of generalizing in more depth. Number one, show the prevalence of what you observed. You connect your data with what is happening in the world. An example of this is that in the results chapter, you presented this information. The respondent felt that the care staff had a negative attitude towards her because of her age. This is the data that you collected. So now connect this experience of the respondent to the wider prevalence. This was not an isolated incident that you observed. This is something that is prevalent in the wider world. This is something discussed by the wider literature. The respondent's perception of ageism mirrored a recent report that highlighted the prevalence of negative attitudes towards older adults across the health sector. You have now connected your data with the wider world. Number two, the wider context. You could generalize your findings by showing the wider context or wider reasons behind what you observed. For example, you collected a statement from a respondent, or you observed an activity, or you analyzed a campaign, a social media campaign. What are the reasons behind these occurrences? Nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything is connected. We are all subject to wider forces. Perhaps you observed a comment or anomaly, or trend or interaction, or you identified a culture, etc. What gave rise to this? What was the impetus? Where did this emerge from? You want to point to the wider context. Maybe you saw that it was related to the wider organization. Maybe it came out of a toxic work environment, or it came out of a creative work environment, or it was influenced by the hierarchy of that organization, or it was a result of an authoritarian management style. Link what you saw to the wider organization. Or historical reasons. This did not come out of nowhere. It may be linked to a series of historical events. Or the political context, change of government, Brexit, political climate, etc. Or the current socio-economic climate, like the current cost of living crisis. Or the regulatory context, government regulation has impacted what you saw. Or the wider sector context, it may be due to wider industry developments. Or market forces have impacted the way the product was developed. Try not to make your context too wide. Be very conservative. Only discuss the context that directly relates to your study. Do not go too wide with this. So, for example, a student documented a social media campaign to address the woke and cancel culture in the advertising sector. The student postulated that it could be due to the wider sector context. This may have been in reaction to a series of diversity and inclusion projects launched in the advertising sector in this period. Or it could have been the regulatory climate. The ASA recently banned harmful gender stereotypes in advertisements. It could be a number of these reasons. So the student is putting forth the wider context. Lastly, you should try to connect your data with theories, models, or the wider literature. Here is an example. First, mention your data. Your data reveals that the increased use of Uber services in the Croydon area have resulted in 4 minicab offices stopping their operations. This is the data that you collected. Then connect your data with models, theories, or the wider literature. This development resembles Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction. This linking sentence is very important. This is where you explicitly link your observation with the wider literature. Then define or expand upon the theories, models, or wider literature. It is important that whenever you introduce a term, or you introduce a theory, or you introduce a model, that you define it. Give a nice full definition of whatever you introduce. And for even more marks, mention any discrepancies between your data and the theory, the model, or the wider literature, just like we discussed with uncovering a problem. This will get you critical analysis marks. If the theory, the model, or the literature does not match up with your data, mention it and postulate the reason why. We will now discuss the 2 templates of the results and discussion chapters. To download these templates, just go below this video in the description box and you will find the download link to download these 2 templates. Before we go through the 2 templates, it is important to clarify some issues. The first of which is your approach. You can adopt the detached approach. This is where you separate the results section and discussion section into 2 separate chapters. This is where you describe and specify your findings in the results chapter. Then in the following chapter, the next chapter, you uncover and generalize your findings. So in one chapter, you describe and specify. Then in the next chapter, you uncover and generalize. Or you can adopt the attached approach. This is where you combine the results section and discussion section into one chapter. So you may spend a few paragraphs describing and specifying the content of your interviews or your surveys or your questionnaires or your data set. Then in the following paragraph, this is where you do the analysis. You uncover and generalize the content of your interviews, surveys, questionnaires, or data set. So you present your results, then you discuss them, analyze them. Present your results, then discuss them. Present your results, then discuss them. Present your results, then discuss them. You follow this formula. The headings of your results and discussion chapters can be derived from your objectives or your research questions. It's very important. Every chapter in your dissertation, you must always reference or go back to your objectives or research questions. Every chapter should speak to your objectives or your research questions. So for instance, if your objective 1, was to explore the nature of fitness in a postmodern world, your heading within your results and discussion chapter would be this. If your objective was this, one of the headings in your results and discussion chapters would be this. Or if you use research questions, your first research question, you will transform that into a heading. And within these headings, you can put subheadings, but these headings would be the main headings in your results and discussion chapters. And this makes it clear to the marker that you are only concerned with meeting your objectives. You are only concerned with answering your research questions. So let's start now. Go to template 1 on page 2, and you'll find that the headings for the findings and results section are exactly the same or very similar to the headings in the discussion and analysis section. So 4.1, for example, this is just an example for this PowerPoint slide. 4.1, the nature of fitness in a postmodern world. You would put a similar heading in the discussion section. The only difference is that when you're looking at the nature of fitness in the postmodern world, in your findings section, you're just describing and specifying the nature of fitness in a postmodern world. But in the next chapter, you're looking at that same area, but instead you're uncovering and generalizing the nature of fitness in a postmodern world. 4.1, very descriptive and specific. But the next chapter, you're looking at exactly the same area, but you're looking at this from an analytical point of view. Another example, 4.2, the relationship between digital fitness and traditional forms of fitness. You're looking at this from a descriptive and specifying point of view. And then you'll cover the same area in the next chapter, but you'll be uncovering and generalizing this aspect. So we see how they mirror each other. We can see how they are two sisters, looking at the same areas, but doing something different. When you download the template, it should take you to this page. This is the contents page. Template 1, the detached approach, is on page 2, and template 2, the attached approach, is on page 4. You can choose either of these approaches, the detached approach or the attached approach, depending on your needs. So let's start by looking at template 1, the detached approach, on page 2. 4.0 findings. As with all chapters in your dissertation, you start with a mini introduction. State the aim of this chapter, what is the purpose of this chapter. Then also explain how this chapter is arranged. Give an overview of the areas that you will cover. The first section will discuss this. This will be followed by a discussion on this. This will be followed by a presentation on this. However you arrange your chapters, make sure that you give an overview of the chapters. So now, 4.1, the heading of this section is derived from your first objective or your first research question, as we discussed. So in this section, you'll describe and specify your findings in this area of your first research question or your first objective. And feel free to add subheadings within these sections as well. 4.2, exactly the same formula. Take this heading from your second objective or your second research question, then describe and specify your findings in this area. So this whole chapter, we're just concerned with presenting our findings, describing our findings, specifying your findings. No analysis whatsoever is taking place in this chapter. The heading of this section is derived from your third objective or your third research question. Describe and specify your findings in this area. And finally, we'll end with a conclusion, 4.4, summarize the key themes of this chapter and escort the reader to the discussion chapter. So now that we discussed the findings, it's important to analyze these findings, which will be done in the discussion chapter. You have escorted your reader to the next chapter. So if you do take the detached approach, the next chapter will be the discussion chapter, and same thing, introduction, mini introduction. Every chapter in your dissertation should have a mini introduction. So state the aim of this chapter and explain how this chapter is arranged. The heading of this section is derived from your first objective or your first research question. So the heading in your findings section and your discussion section should be fairly similar. Once again, the heading of this section is derived from your second objective and your second research question. So as I said, very similar headings for your findings chapter and your discussion chapter, just that you're doing different things. In the findings chapter, you're just presenting your data, and in this chapter, you're analyzing your data. 5.3, exactly the same thing. So you may have 3 objectives or 4 objectives or 2 objectives, depending on how much objectives you have, but make sure that you put subheadings within these objectives. And I just want to touch on this, the discovery. I've called it the discovery, but you can call it whatever you want. You can call it after the thing that you discovered, or student put an excellent name forward, revelation. So whatever you want to call it. So within this section, you mentioned discoveries of interesting issues that are slightly outside of your objectives or research questions. So if you're looking at something very specific, but you find something interesting that's slightly outside of your objectives or slightly outside of your research questions, this is the place to put it, because you don't want to put it in the main body, because in the main body, you are only concerning yourself with the main objectives and the main research questions. You're sticking to the topic. You're not veering. You're religiously sticking to what you've identified as your objectives and your research questions. But during the course of your data gathering, your interviews, your surveying, and you come across some really useful piece of information, which is slightly related to your topic, but not totally, this is the place to put it. So in this example, I've noticed, though this study was focused on the learning development of students, so I've made it clear, this is my focus, the learning development of students. This is my main focus. However, I'm putting forward this because there's a slight relation to it. So the students' responses consistently indicated that the academic development of their lecturers required equal attention. So you explain why this is a significant discovery, and even maybe point to further research that is needed in this area. Then you'll end with a conclusion. Summarize the key themes of this chapter and escort the reader to the conclusion chapter. So now let's look at template 2, the attached approach, which is the findings and discussion in one chapter. So this differs from template 1. So the same thing. The findings and discussion chapter, you still have to do a mini introduction for both of them. So you really need to explain what you're doing, especially if you're merging the findings and discussion chapter. You need to explain the purpose of this chapter or the purpose of doing so, and also explain how the chapter is arranged. Give an overview of what you will cover in this area. So the same thing again, the heading of this section is derived from your first objective or your first research question. So you'll spend a few paragraphs describing and specifying your findings in the area, just a few paragraphs. And then this will be followed by the analysis, uncovering and generalizing your findings in the area in a few paragraphs. So you'll follow this pattern: presentation of findings, analysis, presentation of findings, analysis. And the thing that you are analyzing is the same thing you're describing. So you have to make sure you have to stay on topic. Whatever you're describing, you're analyzing. Whatever you're specifying, you're generalizing. So you have to make sure that you stay within the realm of the heading of this section. And once again, you put your discovery. If you find anything slightly outside of your objectives or research questions, this is a place to put it, and you end with a conclusion.